Jim, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Derek. How are you, sir?
Good. All right. We're going to talk about actions. That's
Okay.
what you do.
Yeah, I kind of figured maybe that's what this might be about, is actions.
Yeah. So, number one, how do you start making actions? Because that's a pretty interesting story from what I heard.
Well, I had always been intrigued with making things better, and I started with truing up Remington 700s, and Bob Adamovich and I consulted with Bob Brackney some back in the day when he was doing action truing. And Bob was an engineer for Bird Machine, and I was engineer for Procter & Gamble, and we always wanted to shoot better. And everybody seemed to be satisfied with the status quo. Oh, you use this XP 100 or Remington Mohawk or whatever action in a sleeved thing, or you use a Panda or you use a hard action and blah, 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 blah. Well, I was noticing vertical and things like that and thought, God, these bolts fit loose, and Bob was doing the same thing. But so we started truing up XPs and Mohawks and Remington 700s and recutting the threads, recutting the seats, putting the silver brazen the bands on the bolts, which became known eventually as the Borden bumps. Long story of how we don't need to get into how that got there, but
well, what are the Borden bumps? Just explain what they are.
What happened is tried to make some bolts that would go through a Remington action all the way that had minimum clearance, like a thousandths and a half clearance between the action. Well, Eric, they wouldn't go all the way because there's bellies in the actions, there's humps, and we'd hone them, and they still wouldn't smoothly go all the way. So looked at it and said, geez, what if we just take the Remington bolts and turn a section right in front of the bolt handle, put a band on it, turn that band so that it fit the action hole that we reamed and honed to. At those times, some actions cleaned up at 703, some cleaned up at 705. So we had all different size bolt bands. Didn't standardize at first. And because what we found is part of the vertical was coming from, and everybody was neck sizing. And they were neck sizing because if you used a folding sized case, you got terrible vertical. And it was just accepted. Oh, you need to load the lugs of the action against the bolt lugs to get rid of that, help get rid of that vertical. But gee, if you put a bolt in the gun, you'd watch it and you close the handle, the rear end of the shroud, everything's raising up in the air. So you'd Prussian blue the bolt lugs and put it in there with nothing in the chamber, and nothing come off the top lug. So the top lug wasn't touching. And people said, well, geez, they're lapped. Well, these are lapped. We've lapped them with a plunger and a holder that screws into the front of the action. And, well, geez, Jim, you just need the neck size. Well, neck sizing led to irregularities, Eric, because, as you found out years ago, and the big joke going around, oh, Eric only neck sizes, but is you get different pressure against the bolt face and the lugs on the action when you close the bolt. And guess what? Those shots go in a different place. It drives you nuts at short distance, let alone long distance. It amplifies and then get even more vertical from those kinds of things. So we put that band there, and then the front end of the bolt was wobbly. It wasn't controllable when you closed the bolt. It worked well. So put a band on the front of the bolt behind the lugs, and then profiled it so that it was elliptical, basically, so that when you had the bolt open running up and down the raceway, it was the same diameter as the Remington 700 bolt. Then when you closed the bolt, The rear end was cylindrical, the front end was elliptical. And so when you closed the bolt, it helped lock up and kept that bolt straight so your firing pin hit was centered. And gosh, it made a big difference. You know, the first action that I had done July 4th, 1981, I shot a 1580 light varmint 100-yard 5.5 shot group bag at South Creek, Pennsylvania. I think second place was 2,500 or 2,600. I think it was a Gary Olcock, if I remember. And everybody says, Jim's got a real Hummer barrel there. Put another barrel on it, shot the same way. Put another barrel on it, shot the same way. I had good bullet jackets, what Radigan and I used to call Superman jackets, that had low run out, and the gun just worked. And then there was some questions about it, so I had another bolt for that. That was an old Remington 722 action. In fact, one that Mike Walker gave me heck about for tearing it apart. It was originally a 222 and had a real low serial number. It was a 4-digit serial number. But anyhow, we took another bolt, put it in it, and did a lot of the truing, but didn't put the Borden bumps on it. The gun shot basically in the .2s and .3s. Put the other bolt in it, and it shot in the 0s and .1s with the same cases, same bullets, same load. So, and it went from there, and for years I trued up those actions, and then I started working with two other action makers, good friend Bob Dodd, RFD Precision. Bob's really was attentive to detail, did a good job making actions, and I put the bolt sleeves, bushed the firing pins, because he was doing 72,000 to 73,000 firing pins. So I was doing 65,000 firing pins with a 67,000 hole. So I was bushing the bolts. He didn't have any problem with that, and we collaborated. But Bob didn't want to get big. He wanted to have, you know, if he made 20 actions a year or 25 actions a year, he was happy. He wanted to keep it as kind of a retired person's hobby. I had other ideas, and I think we've told the story before about how I tried to get another action maker to adopt the principles, offered to give them all the technology and show them what I was doing as long as they made actions for me that way, and threw me out of the shop and called me a toilet paper engineer. So then Glenn Harrison at Nisika approached me and said, well, geez, would you work with me? So we got together, and he had the Nisika J, I had the Borden TPE. Glenn was making them, and I was then doing some work on the bolts, the firing pins, and the cocking pieces and springs and stuff to meet my desires. And then he and I, at about 2001, couldn't see eye to eye on things, and no hard feeling. It's just, we just didn't see things the same way. I was continually tearing into everything, and nothing was okay. And he took it a little wrong. That's the way I can be sometimes. It's just nothing's good enough, which doesn't mean that it's not good. It just means we need to do better here and just keep. And then Gary Hammond, Trudeau, Jack Sutton, and some others encouraged me. You got all the technology and stuff. Why are you having somebody else helping you make them, and then you're retrofitting things? Just make them. And I already had the building here and part of the family here and everything making the Rimrock stocks. So we, June of 2001, brought the action making completely in-house. For a while, I subcontracted my EDM work to a good friend, and he did well, but I always saw that as an opportunity to do a little different and better. And that was John Pierce, and John actually helped me get my original EDM machine set up, and with the fixture design and everything. And we've collaborated a lot over the years on a whole lot of things around the actions. But I had just different ideas of how to go about EDMing them than everybody else was. Got the help of Aggie Charmy, who is now George Fisher, USA, of helping make my ideas come to reality of how to go about EDM and raceways so that they were truer and didn't have as big a belly in the middle. But so it went from a little thing to, geez, I don't know. We can make roughly 1,000 actions a year now, and we're over 10,000 actions into it. And so and with the whole focus all the time, and there was, at first, people got a little frustrated because my nitpicking, we went from a 965 headspace to a 950 headspace to a 915 headspace to a 900 headspace. But by BR action number 80 or 85, I settled on 900 because I kept making the bolt head thicker to allow more firing pin trap, because I didn't want the firing pin to be guided by the boss on the firing pin. I kept making the bolt heads thicker from the back of the lugs to the bolt face to give me more room for increased firing pin travel and firing pin trap. And by firing pin trap, that means for the whole cycle of the bolt, from bolt open to bolt close, that the firing pin tip never leaves the hole in the front of the bolt. I know Speedy and others had done what I was doing for years. Bob Brackney was doing it. We were mounting bolts in the lathe, Remington bolts and other manufacturers' bolts, because they used the Remington and Winchester technology of having a very short land area from the bolt face to where the firing pin tip hole, whether it was a 72 thousandths hole or 62 thousandths or whatever, some of those holes were only 75 thousandths long. And you had a firing pin fall of 250 thousandths or more. So it was depending on the boss on the firing pin that the spring stops against to guide inside the bolt. Well, none of those holes in those bolts are perfectly true when they're gun drilled that deep. And if you fit it too tight, you create a piston in there. And unless you vent it or rib it around to relieve that air pressure, you end up slowing your firing pin down. And, the original Remingtons, the 721s and 722s, had the very short firing pin tip and the very shallow firing pin hole at the front, and they shot well. And it was because their original manufacturer was controlled so well at how straight that head got put on that bolt body. And that bolt body inside was almost the size of the firing pin boss. So they got away with, when that firing pin tip left the hole, the firing pin was still pointing at the center of the hole. But as years went on, that head started being put on crooked, and the hole inside the bolt wasn't always at size, and the firing pin bosses, to make assembly easier for max firing pins and minimum bolts, that they didn't run into an interference problem. And so we had a lot of actions, Remington 700s originally, on some of the hunting guns that I originally built, that I found, they were basically minute and a half guns. Until, and this was early. This was like late 80s, early 90s. I put a bolt in the milling machine vise and cut it in half. I could look down in there with the old proctologist scopes and think I knew what I was seeing, but I said, screw it. So, and then I cut a couple custom bolts in half. Rather expensive ordeal. But what I learned from it was, and I could put a firing pin in there and say, oh, this is what's going on. That tip is following out of the hole. And when the trigger releases it, the end of the firing pin tips hitting the edge of that hole, and one time it hits the bottom, one time it hits the left side, one time it hits the right side, the next time it might fly through the center of the hole, and you had all sorts of different firing pin energy and impact, which created basically spatter, not only vertical on the target, but just spatter. While bushing the front of that bolt by drilling that out and putting a screw in there and facing the screw and putting a long firing pin hole in it that would trap the entire travel of the firing pin, and then putting the firing pin in a cylindrical grinder and grinding the tip so that it was longer, then you could end up having complete trapped. And I could take a gun that would shoot basically minute of angle or more with an unmodified bolt and make the only modification to the bolt with the Borden bumps and that bush thing, and end up with an eighth to quarter minute gun. Wow. It was just, and Armin Pali from Iowa City, I did a custom action for him that he was struggling with. It basically shot right around 0.28 to 3.3 something. He just could not get that gun to shoot until he borrowed somebody else's bolt one day, stuck it in the gun, and shot different, shot better, but not great yet. So he gave it to me and he says, here's an experiment for you. Prove to me that your technology works. So I put the bumps on the bolt and bushed the bolt face and eliminated all the drag that I could in firing pin system. I think I made a new shroud for it, and a new firing pin. And he went and started shooting .1 ags. Wow. with the same cases, bullets, powder, and the same gun. And he started helping push, hey, you need to look at this kid over here that's doing this stuff and listen to him. And we took all of those things and put it into when we started making the actions and saying, hey, this is only now, instead of remachining bolts, we made the bolts from scratch that way. So they fit right and had the right firing pin. And I kind of settled on, I talked to Stiller a lot at the time. He was a big fan of the 62 thousandths firing pin. I kind of settled on the 65 because I experimented some with the 62, and I tried different shape firing pin tips, semi-hemispherical, hemispherical, compound hemispherical, to change the shape of the footprint of the primer when it hit the firing pin cup. But the 62 thousandths ones on Remington 7.5 primers and Federal primers, lots of times I actually pierced the primer. So I had gone too far. We went from blanking primers at the 73 thousandths hole and a 62, then I'd end up with some pierced ones when I had primers that had soft cups. So
what's the difference between blanking and piercing?
Piercing is when the force, the PSI at the tip of the firing pin is high enough to shear the primer cup and actually punch a hole through it. That's
like
piercing.
A hole punch.
It's like a hole punch. Okay. Bang. It's got so much energy on a small footprint. And of course, larger firing pin falls and heavier springs increase that PSI on that shape of that tip. At 73 thousandths with, in particular, Federal and Remington primers, you have a big enough hole that the pressure that comes back from the cartridge firing through the flash hole to the primer cup is enough to blank the hole, which is the inside pressure. Instead of the firing pin tip causing the hole to occur, the pressure actually uses the edge of the 73 thousandths firing pin hole as a die cutter, and the pressure punches the little blank. Pierced primers, you usually end up with the piece of primer up inside the primer. Blanked primers, you end up with the piece of primer back in your bolt, because the gas also comes through and causes the firing pin assembly to bounce back. And then that little piece of primer many times gets lodged up in there. And then people who have blanked lots of primers then start complaining about failed fires and other things like that, because they end up with pieces of primer between the end of their firing pin boss and the stop inside the bolt, which changes your firing pin protrusion.
Right.
Because the firing pin can't travel all the way.
Yeah, because there's pieces of primer in there.
Yeah.
You said your first action was called the TPE. What did that mean?
Toilet paper engineer.
The Borden toilet paper engineer.
Yep. The guy that don't know shit about firearms. And it was because I was a engineer for Procter & Gamble at the time I was doing this work. And I happened to work for Procter & Gamble paper products and was engineering toilet tissue and towels.
Wow.
And which a lot of people didn't realize, and the person that called me that didn't realize that when it comes to structural steel, you can go pull a handbook off the shelf, Timoshenko and Young, and say, oh, I've got 4142 steel. What's the yield strength? What's the ultimate streak? Oh, it's a straight line curve here to yield, and then it's a curved curve to break. Well, I was doing things called tangent modulus modeling, because the company I worked for, we made Charmin and White Cloud, and their endeavor was forever to get the amount of fiber in a piece of toilet paper down without people poking their finger through it. Okay? So we had to come up with the stress strain values of toilet paper, which is actually pretty in-depth engineering. So a thing that turned out to be made in jest or fun, you know, I just turned around and turned it into, okay, I'm a toilet paper engineer, so my first action is going to be the toilet paper engineer action. And yeah.
That's good stuff, man. That's good history right there. Yeah. Okay, so now that we're on action names, explain the different names, because a lot of people go to your website and you have a lot of different models. So let's explain the models. The TPE is no longer available. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
So what do you have nowadays?
Well, I started, my first actions were the Rimrack BR. BR standing for bench rest. It was an action that had an XP100 bolt throw. By bolt throw, I mean the length of the bolt is basically an XP100 length bolt. It was made so it could be light for light varmint, because most of us were shooting light varmint rifles and light varmint sporter and heavy varmint. They came in at about 28 ounces. And then a little later, I got looking, well, there's guys want varmint guns. The heavy varmint guys want something a little longer. And I didn't want to make the full long action. So I said, well, we're going to make a medium length action. And basically use a Remington 700 bolt throw plus 100 thousandths. Now, if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't do the 700 bolt throw plus 100 thousandths. But at the time, I had ideas about with the springs and stuff, and that's when I was trying to use stock springs and wasn't having my springs custom made for the medium one. They were being custom made for the BR. So I called it BRM, bench rest medium, for the medium length cartridges, the 243, the 6mm Remington, the 308, the 6. Well, at the time we were shooting the 6.5 47, which was a 223 necked up to 6mm. It wasn't the 6.5 47 Lapua.
Okay.
And then, lo and behold, I started getting guys shooting Williamsport, and oh, geez, Jim, we need one for a Magnum. And then I said, well, let's keep this name technology going. This for ease in the shop while we're manufacturing. Let's make that one the BRL, bench rest long.
Okay.
And then made it with Magnum bolt face and 30-06 bolt face, which also pulls and extracts PPCs, as does the BR and the BRM. And very early on, right away, we got started with the BRs with right bolt, left port, right ejects, because that was, in those days in bench rest, that was the most prevalent, and still is to this day, the dual ports are the most prevalent in bench rest. And later we added the drop port, the right bolt, left port, drop port, or the left bolt, right port, drop ports. One of the things, if I had to do over, Eric, I don't think I'd get carried away with the number of SKUs I have. It drives me nuts as a manufacturer, keeping all of the rails and all of the different programs squared away, because when we make an improvement in one program for one action model, it rolls up, and when you've got 100 and some SKUs of action variations, that means somebody has to sit there and modify. Because I'm not smart enough yet, like my friend John Addis at Area 419, to use all the macros that he uses in programming. And my machines are a little older technology in his machines, and one machine I've got just absolutely pukes on trying to use macros. It's 1992 Haas, and yeah, right now I'm probably replacing that. We've got quotes coming in for a new machine to replace that, but I've got quite a bit of Scottish heritage in me on my mother's side, and it just pains me when a machine is making money even though I can see advances with new ones, I hang on, and that's machine numbers 1711 from Haas. And Haas started making machines. Their first machine was 1001. So it's the 711th machine that Haas made.
Wow.
And it's still running.
To Haas.
Yeah. Now I've got Haas machines here with the serial numbers in 3.5 million or whatever. But
wow. So that's the BR series. BR, BRM, BRL.
Yep.
All right.
Then
what else?
A guy came along.
Well, then you have, go ahead.
Yeah. A friend of mine that gave me quite a few not so subtle nudges. Hey, Borden, when are you going to end up making a big action? Well, Eric, I don't know if someone do. You really needed to make a big action, Jim. I think you remember that. I think that was 2015 and 16. You just kept pushing me.
It was earlier than that.
Okay. Yeah. But I think the first one off the machine was either Christmas 2015 or Christmas 2016. I don't remember which, but yeah, it's before the grandkids and everybody got up in the morning. We had finished the programs the day before, and I was so I just wanted to get one of them done and a bolt in one of them. That I worked Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, and before the grandkids got up and finished that first one. And after I did, I said, "Why didn't I do this year? Listen to Eric and do this years ago." And then I looked at it and said, okay, it's the same length as my bench rest medium. All I've done is take the diameter up. What's an easy way here in the shop? And for the engineering type minded people that are out there in the public, they can look at it and say BRMXD. Oh, it says BRM action with extra diameter. So I just, Procter & Gamble taught me that with all of our product not the actual product names that hit the street, but all the projects that we had. It wasn't Project X or Project Y. It always had what do you call it, a mnemonic that went with it. That was the initials of the words, so that anybody out on the floor or in the engineering department, when they looked at that, said, oh, that's the new Charmin that's got this, or that's the new White Cloud that's got this, or the new Bounty that's got that. We had terms to, and so I just adopted that here in the shop for that Rimrock series of actions. And the Rimrock name came from, we were making the Rimrock stocks that we had purchased from Pacific Research Labs on Vashon Island in the 1990s. And I thought, geez, when I transitioned from others making the actions to me making them, I already owned the trademarks, paying for the trademarks on the Rimrock name. And I thought, geez, if this stuff gets any good, I want to make sure that that name is trademarked. So I've kept the trademark registration up to date, and I used that. And I thought, well, we're going to call them the Rimrock actions, and then added the models, the BR and stuff. And then the B came along.
Well, before we move on, you sent me that BRMXD. Said, all right, let me know what you think. And I already had a stock and everything ready to go. I took it over to Speedy, and I said, throw that in there, bed it, do whatever, because I want to take it to Southwest National. So I had, 8 weeks. Or no, it was Christmas, so I had like 4 weeks. So I told Speedy, get this thing ready by Southwest Nationals. We got it ready, but I ended up not shooting that. I mean, I shot it. It was a backup at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, I didn't have enough time.
I remember.
But
yeah.
I remember the minute I tried it, I thought, okay, I need a second one. Just call you up and said, okay, I need the second one. So that's how I ended up with serial number 1 and 2.
Yep.
Okay. Now, fast forward to 2023. Both of those actions were on Team USA, on the 8-man team, and we got the gold medal. We got the world championship, and serial number 1 and 2 were on the line, and there were multiple other Borden actions. I'm going to say, just off the top of my head, at least 50% of them, maybe 60% were Bordens on that team, including the first 2 that you ever made.
That's awesome. That
awesome.
feels good, Eric. And
that is awesome.
And I'm so glad that I listened to your encouragement, and Speedy was pushing me at the same time of, you really got to do this. And I'm so glad I did that bigger action.
Yeah. So thank you for that.
Thank you for using them.
So we'll talk about how it's literally changed the game, in my opinion. But let's keep on talking about the naming convention. So and now you have an M. You say you have an M action?
No, a B.
B action. Okay.
Yeah. And that came about because a very prominent bench rest shooter always shot basically Remington bolt length actions when there was Ali Huber, myself, I think Speedy did some, Lee Huber, Jeff Stover, Bob Adamovich. We used XP 100s length actions. Never had a problem with them. Another custom maker in the Midwest made some little actions called the Firefly to copy the XP 100 length, and this prominent bench rest shooter couldn't get them to shoot, ever. So he condemned all actions that had XP 100 length bolts. And it was coming to the point I couldn't sell a BR action just because of the word on the street, even though there was world champion or U.S. championships, state championships being won, world records being setting, just because this guy said, "Oh, short bolts don't work." I said, So Sid Goodline says, Jim, make something, don't copy a Bat B, but make something that's got a short ting on the back of it, a bigger port. Basically, see if you can match that Rimrock BR weight, but use a Remington 700 short action length bolt in it to satisfy all these guys that now saying that the BRs just don't work. And so I ended up saying, well, okay. And I looked and studied other actions and stuff and the length of the tang, and I shortened up the tang, and I made them only right bolt, left port, right eject, used a big, huge ejection port to cut weight, used the same headspace as the BR and the BRM and the BRXD and the BRL, and I ended up, for light varmint bench rest, coming up with an action that, and I didn't continue in the BR series because I had a different tang. And I had a different footprint, totally different footprint. So I thought, well, my friends at Bat won't mind. I'll just name it the Rimrock B. So that's where the B came from. And even in 2001, we were making hunting actions, and we were calling them the Rimrock SSR and the LSR. Short sheep rifle, long sheep rifle. Putting the facets on the side of them, doing lightning cuts so that even made out of stainless. They weren't as light as titanium, but we could end up having hunting rifles with a Macmillan Edge technology stock and a number 3 barrel and aluminum bottom metal. We'd end up with a 6.5 pound gun.
Do you still make the SSR?
No. I went, once I started making the Alpines. Well, here's another thing that came into that.
I have an SSR.
Yeah. And I was making, and we were using the bumps on the SSR and the LSR because I was still not doing my own EDM work. And as good, the EDM work that I was getting done elsewhere was phenomenal EDM work. But I still had a slight belly in the middle of the action. So if I tried to use an action that didn't have the bumps, that was the size of the bolt without the bumps, the whole length, it wouldn't run smooth, and it'd bind some. Okay, so I still had to use the bumps on the hunting actions. So they were still part of the Rimrock series. In 2005, 6, somewhere there, when I got first EDM, I said, well, okay, I'm going to use some tang now. I'm going to get the hole as straight as I can. I got it straight, but it still had that tiny belly in it. So, and I'm going to share something here I haven't publicly shared before, but I worked with Sun and another outfit, Angus Corporation, and said, I've got an interrupted hole. I can't hone it. Everybody tells me I can't hone this hole. The Angus engineers laughed and said, ha-ha. We've been doing interrupted holes for years. So I got some very expensive, big spiral diamond hones. And we hone, after they come out of the EDM, all the action bores get honed. We're only taking 0.0002 out of them, out of the middle, but it makes that so we can put a 0.7020 pin in one end of the action and gradually push it through the entire action, which I'd never been able to do before on anybody's EDM work or our own until we started doing. So we started that honing early, which then I looked at it and said, geez, these hunting actions, it's a real pain to grind these bumps on all of these. This make bolts that are the size of a bolt with a Borden bump, the full length. Lo and behold, they go in the action. Oh, now I got to change the name. I don't have the bumps on them anymore. And Joan and I were coming back from a Grand Slam of Sheep show, and admiring some mountains and stuff, and I said, alpine, timberline, ridgeline. It fits with rimrock because rimrock is in the mountains. So it kind of is an offshoot of the theme of the mountains and the mountain ranges. We came up with short action being alpine, long action being timberline. And the bolts are the same size as our old SSR, LSR bolts at the bump, only the whole length of the bolt. So we didn't have to put the bump on them anymore. And some people, I had one customer oversee, oh, Jim, I got to have the bumps. Wait a minute, Colin. This is the bump the whole length of the bolt. Oh, okay. It can be made cheaper and deliver the same accuracy as the SSR did and the LSR. So, and then from there, and I differentiated the Alpine and the Alpine Magnum. Alpine Magnum didn't mean Magnum bolt face. The Alpine has a true Remington 700 footprint, except I've got a straight bolt handle instead of a kickback bolt handle. The magazine well is the Remington short action magazine well. The port is the exact copy, and I still remember back when I was working with McMillan at first with the inletting for him, I told Dick Davis, just use the Remington 700 inlet, make a straight bolt notch, and make a place for my bolt stop. Oh, I can't do that, Jim. I've got to have an action. He said, I heard this story from everybody. And so we ended up, I sent him one, and then he gets a hold of me. Dick says, this is an exact Remington 700, Jim. I said, yeah. I've got Mike Walker's old drawings here. I used, and the drawings aren't derived from somebody measuring Remington 700s. They were the actual Remington 700 drawings that I could use. And I made some changes, of course. I got rid of that swamped rear bridge and made a full diameter, and I changed the scope block screw hole to 840s from 648, and the bolt stops on the side of it, but the footprint is the same as a 700. Then I looked and said, geez, we need to accommodate these longer things, the 300 WSMs coming along, the people using 6mm Remingtons, 308 Winchesters, long action's too long, short action's too short. And I looked at Kevin Wyatt's stuff and said, this is perfect fit for, but I wanted to delineate a difference between the actions. So when somebody called us for parts later or emailed for parts, we didn't have to ask a whole bunch of questions back. Well, which magazine well you got? Which,
Right.
So we made the port a 1/4 inch longer and the magazine well for the Wyatts, and we called it the Alpine Magnum, available with a 30-06 bolt, or 308 bolt face, or a Magnum bolt face, or a 223 bolt face. And then the Timberline for the long action, same thing. The Magnum, the 1/4 inch longer port for the longer cases to easy ejection, and then the Wyatt well for longer cartridges. Other than that, they still both fit a Remington 700 inlet, a long or a short. And it just, people, if they've got a Remington 700 inlet of stock, they have to open the magazine well inlet for the Wyatt well. And then we went on to, I was really frustrated with the WSMs. They always fed well from my SSRs and from my Alpine Magnums. However, I looked and said, well, I'm limited to 150 and 165 grain bullet, and the 165 to 168 grain bullet seats a little deep in the case. These things shoot phenomenal. I hate putting them in a long action, because even with the bullet seated out, under recoil, the cartridges were shucking the magazine well because there was so extra space. So I said, I need to make a medium length action. And I looked and said, well, geez, you know, the WSM RSAUM family is going to be 3180, 3160 long. So this make a 3.2 magnet. So I took my drawings for the Alpine action, cut it right through the port, stretched the drawing. I didn't have to redraw the whole thing. In CAD, I just sectioned it in the middle and say, stretch that baby and make that magazine well 3.2 inches long. Boom. And there came the ridgeline action. And Andy Hawkins really helped out with making me custom bottom metal for it. And the action really took off. And then when the 6.5 PRC came along, it has taken off even more, although a lot of manufacturers are still putting the 6.5 PRC in the Alpine Magnum one with the 3-inch magazine box, and they shoot well and perform well. But you can get more performance out of them in the Ridgeline because you can shuck the bullet out farther.
Well, I'm glad you're telling me this because people ask me all the time, you know, because the 6.5 PRCs, even the PRCW and the you know, they ask, what should I use a long action? I go, well, yeah, you need to use a long action to get the true performance. I did not realize that you had that medium action that would work perfectly for that.
It's perfect for it. The long action works, but the medium action works even better. So
okay, perfect. Good to know. So that is your Ridgeline action.
Yes.
So somebody wants to build a 6.5 PRC with maximum performance, or even, you know, I've gotten a lot of emails about that PRCW. They want to build it just as a hunting rifle, whatever. I said, perfect. Borden Ridgeline.
And the 284 Winchester, the 284 Winchester Shane. It's made with a 30-06 bolt face too, the Ridgeline.
Okay. So fire up the machine because you're going to get a lot of orders for the Ridgeline. Now that we understand what it does. Because that's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Keep going.
All right.
I'm learning a lot.
Yeah. Well, then, you know, I continuously got bugged for many years to build actions for the 3378 Weatherby and the 338 Lapua. And I know Jerry Stiller and Dan Littlejoe both were in the same camp I was in. I kept looking at, wait a minute, these guys that are doing this are increasing their bolt diameters to 750, but they're keeping the Remington lug height and the Remington lug OD and the barrel tenon. And I talked to some of the manufacturers that I was friends with and stuff, and they said, well, geez, Jim, the guns aren't blowing up. Yeah, well, they're not blowing up, but, you know, I've done the calculations. Jerry's done the calculations, and Dan's done the calculations, and you got too much lug seat pressure. You're going to have bolt setback, and you're going to have barrel tenon swell. Well, geez, the guns aren't coming apart. And many gunsmiths were telling me, and I had a couple that modified some of our Timberline actions, and so we purposely, it was 2010 or so, I reduced the nose diameter on my Timberline actions on purpose. And people said, Jim, why'd you make that change? So that people couldn't open that bolt face to 590. I made the bolt head the same, but the bolt counterboard that went in the back, I reduced the size enough so that they'd have a pretty thin wall if they ended up trying to increase it to 5.9. I wanted to stop people doing it because I didn't want the liability of those cases being shot on an 1 1/16 18 thread and a bolt lug major diameter of 970 with a 428 high lug. And so, and I had the drawings done for years, and my friend Bob Vestal, who makes a lot of the long-range guns, kept pushing me, and I kept saying, well, there's not that much demand out there. There's not that much demand. And then all of a sudden, the ELR stuff started taking off, and the 338 Lapua Magnum action became more readily available in the United States, and then Sacco was making or Seiko, however you want to say that, was making the 338 Lapwas. And I said, well, okay, it's time. And I was really at a loss. I says, well, my mountain theme here, I'm not sure whether we call it, I've already, and I thought, well, just on a lark, I'm going to post on my Facebook page of seeing how much interest there is in this, and a little contest for coming up with the name. And friend Jason Peterson, who's used our Rimrock actions quite a bit in bench rest, a lot of people submitted names, and I wanted something catchy and maybe a little funny or whatever, and something that represented that it was bigger. And he sent me a thing, well, call it the Yeti. And I said, well, I can't do that. That's a trademark name, and it's trademarked in the firearms industry, not only the cooler industry, but. And he came back with, well, then just call it Bigfoot. So what I did is I increased the size of a timber line from 1/360 in diameter to 1/400 in diameter. Went from an 1" 16 thread to an 1" 1" 18 thread to an 1" 16 or an 1" 18 thread. And the diameter of the action increase is equivalent to the increase in the difference between those two thread tenons. Then I studied and said, okay, and I did a lot of sketches and rough calculations of bolt thrust, and said, geez, I go into the 750 diameter bolt, but I've got the 1" 18. I'm going to increase the head diameter. So I took the head diameter of the bolt up to, I think it's 1" 50. It starts with 1 1/8 steel, but 1" 50. And then I said, geez, that footprint still isn't quite enough for the pressure of not getting set back in the lugs in the action. So take the lug height up. And so I took it to 473 on the bolts, 480 through the action, where the regular actions are 435. As a side note there, I'm just going to interject. People say, well, why do I need a custom action wrench for your BRMs and BRs and stuff? I said, you've got to remember that my actions came from bench rest. And one of the most frustrating things with trued up Remingtons with their basically 450 Raceway is if you threw a 6 ppc case fast into a trued up Remington, it could roll over into the opposite Raceway and wedge itself. And you'd try to run the bolt forward, and the harder you pushed, the harder that case was lodged in the Raceway. So that's where the 435 Raceway came from, is the case wouldn't roll into there and get lodged in there. But anyhow, so I took the action Raceway to 480, the bolts to 473, which ends up giving me the equivalent square inches on my bolt lug thing and my shear area under the bolt lugs, so that 65,000 PSI has a huge safety margin and no lug setback in my action. Where the actions that have the 750 diameter bolt with the Remington lug height and the Remington bolt diameter, I've seen some of those with 20 rounds, factory rounds, 20 factory 338 Lapua mag rounds through them. And you can feel the bolt when you close it, and you can feel the bolt, the hitch, and then you get a tight case in there, and you've got a yank and snap on it. And if you pop the barrel off and look in there, you can see the imprint of the lugs in the action with permanent setback in the lug seat of the actions. And so, and the Bigfoot is taken off pretty good. I have one supplier, Ryan Precision, that sells, he's been the biggest promoter of them, and he tries to stock them on the shelf and sell them for the 338 Norma mags, 338 Lapua mags, 300 Norma mags, and all those guys doing all that kind of stuff. And then I had some people that wanted, well, we like your BRLXD, and we want to shoot some ELR with a single shot gun. Jim, why don't you make your BRLXD with the same bolt and the same threads? So we did, and we called that the Rimrock Denali.
Okay.
You know, what, I think it's the highest mountain in North America, right? And I thought, well, that fits. It's bigger than the rest of ours. So that's where, so the BRLXD and the Denali, Rimrock Denali, have the exact same stock footprint. They just use a bit different barrel tenon and a different bolt.
Okay.
I know it gets confusing for people, and I had a good friend remind me last night, man, Jim, it's hard wading through your website with all these actions. Well, I'm an engineer, and I tried with friend Greg to lay the website out from a logic perspective, but I'm finding a lot of the public doesn't use logic. I look at the website and say, oh, actions, Rimrock, Alpine, Timberline. You click on this. There's a tree that comes out. You go down the tree. It works like a logic diagram.
Well,
but the left
it's
brain,
your logic, the problem.
Yeah. But left brain thinkers don't think the same, and they look at things differently, and it confuses them. So I do have to do something with the website in the near future to make it easier for people to enter and see.
Well, you can just do hunting actions, bench rest actions, you know.
Ah, yeah.
And, you know, that way somebody wants to come over there and look for hunting action. They can just click hunting and all your hunting actions are there.
That's simple, Eric. Thanks.
And, you know, if I'm going to be a bench rest shooter or if I'm going to shoot F-class or bench rest, you know,
yeah,
you know, the BRs, all the BR line would pop up. You know what I mean? And you would have bench rest, and then you would have 100-yard, you know, the different disciplines, right? Because you're not going to use a BR MXD for 100-yard, and you're not going to use the BR for 1,000. So break it up into disciplines rather than model numbers. Because like I said, up until right now, I didn't understand what any of this meant. So that means you got to go through them all. But if you break it down in that sense, like I already forgot the name of the action. The Timberline, was that it?
Yeah, the long action. Yeah.
Well, the one that has the 3.2 mag well for
Ridgeline.
Ridgeline. See what I mean? So they would go under hunting, and then it would say
short,
this is
medium, long.
Yeah, and then you would explain what short means, what medium means, and what long means, and you know, and then people can wade through that real fast because
I like that.
Anyway, that would be my suggestion.
Thanks.
But anyway, but we're not done. Wait, there's more.
You're going to trap me into talking about the new one, right?
Oh, there's a new one? What? I was talking about we haven't talked about the Mountaineer. Oh,
okay. That's right. I almost forgot about the Mountaineer.
Well, I'm glad there's, wow. Okay. Well, yeah. You heard it here.
Well, I've got the Alpines, the Ridgelines, and the Timberlines, the Alpine Magnums and the Timberline Magnums that are inch 360 diameter actions, Remington 700 footprints. And they have a big open port, hunting port on them. You know, the port comes up around the top, and it's so that you can get your thumb in there to load magazines and stuff, which those actions shoot phenomenally well. And like McCorder Custom Rifles and Roland Rifle Works and Darrell Hall and a lot of people using them that are making true 5.3 shot group, quarter MOA ag rifles. And yes, Brian Litz, you can come and shoot one of them with us, and we'll show you. They're true quarter MOA rifles with a shooter, reading the wind and the mirage and stuff that those guns shoot at. However, I had a bunch of people eager to make, at first, single shot actions like the Remington 40X. Only wanted it stiffer. So I looked at it and said, well, I can put my, basically my Rimrock BR port in it lengthen it a little bit to make it the Remington 700 short action port, which stiffens and get rid of those facets on the side of the action that all I did them for was to reduce weight. And said, gee, okay, I'm running out of mountain chains. Oh, let's just call it the Mountaineer. And I only made the short action first and single shot. They started out. And then some guys said, well, geez, we want a repeater, but we aren't going to feed them from the top because we're going to use detachable box magazines and shoot these things for PRS and stuff. And I said, oh, okay. I can put a repeater mag well in them, but I'm going to make the repeater mag well basically so you can't use Remington bottle metal with it, because I don't want any of the griping later, hey, I can't get my thumb in here to load from the top. Me, here in the shop, I can still load those from the top if we did put a Remington, but I roll the cartridges in. Most guys don't roll the cartridges in. I've watched them. I've watched them when we used to go to the Harrisburg show and to the Grand Slam shows. They take their thumb and put it over the top and push down, where I take the thumb from the side. I put the cartridge in and I push the cartridge from the side and roll it in. And it's always been easier. It's like rolling things in versus pushing things in. But so I did that. Well, the next thing I had a gunsmith and person that sells a lot of my ads. Make one of them in a medium for me. Oh, what am I going to call this?
What was the purpose of the medium?
Wanted to do some WSMs.
Okay.
Repeaters for basically PRS, more, and have more bullet seating length to use the 180 and 190 VLDs. Mm-hmm. So wanted the medium action. And then out of that came some people that then wanted to shoot the bigger magnums with detachable box magazines in chassis. And so the long one. And I decided, well, I'm having a hard time with names. I was, okay, I'm going to have a Mountaineer short, a Mountaineer medium, and a Mountaineer long.
All right, Jim. When you start running out of names, that should have been an indication you got too many SKUs.
I've got way too many SKUs, Eric.
And I've talked to you about this.
Yes.
I mean, now that I have a machine shop myself, I'm trying to minimize SKUs.
Yep.
And because, like you said, just one SKU has, and then you start doing variations, and I can see how you got here. Don't get me wrong, but it's.
I know.
So anyway, is that all the actions?
Got to think a minute.
All right. Well, I think that's all the actions. If not, you can go see them on his soon to be released new and improved website that's going to have, hunting, competition, whatever. His website can be laid out.
I like the idea. I can follow that logic.
If you're a hunter, you don't need to look at all the other stuff. And you can just look there. Yep. Anyway. All right. I got a lot of topics, Jim, so we got to move on, man. Action maintenance. That's a big one. What? Somebody buys a custom action from you or from anybody else or even just any action. What Remington 700 footprint, what is a way that they need to take care of these actions?
One of the biggest no-nos is never dry the action completely out. Or if you do decide to completely dry the action out with brake clean, or I can't remember the name of all the rest of those spray cleaners and soaking cleaners. If you do, re-lubricate it. The steels need a layer of lubrication on them, whether they're black nitrided or not. Black nitride helps with a lubrication layer, but I get so many people that clean their actions up pristine, clean their bolts up pristine, take them apart, take bolts apart, clean all of the grease off of everything. And right now I'm going through the do not do's, which is do not remove all the grease from the threads on the shroud. Do not remove all of the that oily feeling from the firing pin shaft. Do not remove the oily feeling from the cocking piece. And the slick feeling on the outside of the bolt is there for a purpose. And if you do decide to clean your action and clean all of that stuff off and get it nice and pristine dry, relubricate it. Well, how do we relubricate it? Well, here's my tips on how to relubricate. I like Mill.com oil. And I can't remember whether it's Mill.com 25 or which number it is, but the little squeeze tube with the oil in it, because it's more synthetic based than break free. We use a lot of break free, which is still petroleum distillate derived, which means you have to maintain your action more often, particularly if you've been in cold weather climates or dirty climates. You need to do it. But the break free works really good. You take and you drop 3 or 4 drops down into the back of the bolt and takes a little bit of compressed air. I don't like using canned air because canned air has a higher degree of water content usually than compressed air. Just a couple of shots to blow that film around the inside of there to protect the inside of the bolt. Then if you've disassembled your firing pin system, which we're going to talk more about in a minute. It's bolt maintenance issues are driving us nuts here recently, the number of bolts we're getting back. But anyhow, take the bolt completely, the firing pin system completely apart by driving out the roll pin in the back. Drive it out with a 3/32 inch punch, preferably a punch that's made for roll pins, so that the punch centers on the roll pin and drives it out without burring and enlarging the size of the hole in the cocking piece in the firing pin. Take the cocking piece off and pull the firing pin thing out. Check your spring for burrs on the end of the spring, and we deburr all of them and stuff, but it's just a good check. Make sure there's no burrs where the ground flat is on the end of the spring and the inside of that ground flat where it slides over the firing pin. Clean off your firing pin shaft, your cocking piece, wash out the shroud. We've even thrown them in carburetor cleaner to get the dried grease and stuff off of them, and then rinsed them in a ultrasonic bath. And then relubricate the firing pin shaft, the whole length of it, with a couple of drops of the Mill.com oil or break free or an equivalent synthetic oil or a very low petroleum distillate oil. Problem with the petroleum distillates is with temperature changes and stuff, they can congeal. So you want a very low viscosity oil on there and a protective oil. And you rub it. I burnish it in. I rub it hard between my fingers until it almost heats. And I can still feel that oil on that shaft, but it's there. Some of my customers also use the Sentry Solutions Teflon graphite based sprays, or not sprays, the powders and the lubricants, and that works well too, but it dissipates fast. Make sure the spring is clean and dry. The inside of the shroud, take a Q-tip, put the oil on it, and you can see in there from the back where the land is, where the firing pin rides. Oil that. Oil the entire back into the shroud. That cocking piece shouldn't be touching it, but it should be oiled just in case the cocking piece does touch it. And then a real thin layer of oil on the cocking piece itself, particularly focusing on the sides of the cocking piece tongue. The round part isn't as important, but the cocking piece tongue. Reassemble your firing pin assembly and a firing pin disassembly tool with the shroud screwed into it and the spring compressed with the shaft sticking out. And then I recommend that you have some kind of a Delrin block or something to put up and under the firing pin and cocking piece, so that when you drive the roll pin back through it, you don't have a cantilevered firing pin out there that you're beating on that snug fitting roll pin, and you can't permanently bend the firing pin because of the material they're made out of, the hardness. I just don't like the idea of the beating on that thing extended out there and having it bowing like that. And it helps you also control getting that roll pin in there and getting it in there flush or a little below the surface of the cocking piece, so that there's nothing sticking out. And then you run your fingers over it to make sure that your punch hasn't slipped and created burrs on the edge of those cocking piece holes that then are going to drag against your shroud when you put it back together. Now you take, I like white lithium grease. A lot of the bolt greases are wheel bearing greases. Wheel bearing greases are rolling friction greases. They depend on rolling elements against each other to have the correct film and the film thickness and the film strength. Where white lithium grease is a sliding friction grease, and it's made for things like milling machine ways and anywhere you've got, like in vehicles, I can't remember where they use it in the vehicles, but where you got two sliding surfaces together. So that's perfect for the back of the bolt lugs and in the cocking piece slot. And since we're using it there, why put another grease on the threads? That grease also works on the threads of the shroud. I apply it a little more liberally than some people like, but I like that shroud when it's in that bolt with no firing pin in it. When I turn that with that grease on it, I don't want any drag. I want that shroud rotating back and forth easy, because that helps with bolt lift. And so after you've got it all assembled and you got grease on the threads, you use a bolt disassembly tool, screw it back into the bolt. And then we use a little trick with the white lithium grease here in the shop. We use Molly D, the powder, mixed with white lithium grease in little cups. And we've got it in some syringes too. We add a little bit of Molly D to that white lithium to put in the cocking cam slot in the back of the bolt, specifically to make that glide smoother when you go to open the bolt. Then the whole bolt body lightly burnished with either the mill.com oil or brake free, because even though my actions are hard and have a differential between the bolt and the action, all steels, coated or not, still will semi-chatter against each other if there's no dry film or even wet film lubrication, just because the coefficient of friction between two pieces of dry steel is very high. And so you want something on that bolt. And it's one of the most current things that I've seen on some of the forums on Facebook, and is, completely dry your bolt off. No, please don't completely dry your bolt off, and don't dry the inside of the action. We use camera swabs, camera sensor cleaner swabs that you can get from B&H and some of the other camera houses, where they're the felt swab that's, I wish I had some of them in the office here right now, but they're built like a Q-tip, only they're flat. So that you can put just a little bit of that brake free or mill.com oil on that, just a drop of it, and you can run it up and down the raceway and on the inside of the flat parts of the bolt raceway. So when you put your bolt in, it just glides. And yes, I've used them in Phoenix. The people say, well, geez, Phoenix is dirty and dusty. And Midland, Texas. Well, I shot a number of times in Midland, Texas, and Phoenix, and I always treated my actions this way. I went through those little dust devils. I never had a bolt hang up on me or have any problems. And in Alaska once, I even showed a guide and a bunch of guys from Georgia in base camp that says, oh, you're one of them. You're like your buddy Kenny Jarrett. You're one of them bench rest guys. Your stuff always fits so tight. You get out there in the brush and your gun's going to jam. And the guide, Wayne, said, Jim, go get your rifle from tent. I went and got the rifle, and he told Gordon, go get your Model 70. Wayne went over to some of that shin tangle and says, load your magazines full. We both, Gordon and I, loaded our magazines full, and Wayne went over and stripped a whole bunch of stuff from the shin tank, what we called the shin tangle there in western Alaska. Had 2 hands full of it. Threw it in my action with the bolt open, threw it in Gordon's Model 70, pre-64 with the bolt open. And he says, cycle the action. Boom, 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 boom. Gordon got halfway down the raceway with the first round. The bolt locked up. And those guys, how's that possible? I said, watch these flutes on this bolt. Oh, they aren't there for looks. They would catch all that stuff, and when you turned it'd clip all of those little leaves and fragments and stuff and just turn it into it went down in your magazine box, or it went up in the front in the breech area, but it never stopped the bolt. So I don't worry. And the PRS guys, oh, you got to have 6,000 or 7 thousandths clearance between your bolt body and your action hole. No, you're costing yourself hits, buddy. You got all this fancy technology and scopes level and scopes perpendicular, and then you want 6 thousandths clearance on your bolt? You're going to have vertical on your targets. I know you're only shooting at 2 MOA, but wouldn't it be better if you had a 1/4 MOA gun shooting at a 2 MOA target? You'd have more hits. So, and that's, but the maintenance thing is, clinical clean is not the place to be. It needs to be clean and functional, if you know what I mean. It's got to be be able to work. So those are the primary areas of maintenance. Other areas of maintenance are, of course, take your trigger out once in a while, flush it out with lighter fluid, and then blow it out. And if you're one that doesn't like using bore guides, or you stand your gun up in the vault to store it, and you use petroleum distillate cleaners, you're going to have gunk in your trigger, and triggers have to be actually taken apart and I think anybody can go back on my Facebook page and on the Borden Accuracy Facebook page and look back there, and you'll see some pictures of some triggers where guys have stored their rifles vertical in the vault, and they're absolutely gunked up inside to the point where the levers won't even hardly work, because they basically turn to varnish, or some people call it cosmoline, but it's varnish from the breakdown of the petroleum distillates as a brownish colored staining stuff that's gummy. And then, of course, the thread area, you just keep lubricated with Never Sees. I like the silver Never Sees better than the copper Never Sees, because it's specifically made for stainless joints, and stainless joints that take heat. So
you're talking about the barrel tenon between the barrel and the action?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Let's see, other areas of main. Oh, I want to talk about, and I know you've been part of it, getting people to change firing pin springs, and God bless you. I'll run a firing pin spring 20, 30,000 rounds. And I ran them that long and set world records. But what works for different people is different folks, different strokes, and I'm okay with that. My biggest issue is with there's a lot of people that aren't mechanics that are changing their own spring. Oh, this is easy. We just put this in this tool, drive this pin out. You wouldn't believe how many firing pin assemblies and bolts what we're getting back here with bird cocking pieces, bird cross pins, firing pin shaft. We've had one that the firing pin shaft was actually galled to the inside of the shroud. Because while they got it apart, they say, oh, geez, Borden left all this oil or something in here, and they're completely cleaning them. Pristine, clean, reassemble them with no lubrication, and then going to shoot them. And this one gentleman, in fact, had one lock up at the range on him. The shroud threads seized to the inside of the bolt because there was no grease on the shroud threads, and the firing pin shaft galled to the inside of the shroud.
Wow.
So it cost him a bolt because we couldn't salvage it. But so if they are going to change, and we've been thinking about doing a little, I had one video, which isn't a great video, on how to do the firing pin spring change, but daughter and sons and son-in-law and I are looking at doing another one on how to properly take apart your bolt, how to change the firing pin spring, how to, get it apart, how do you reassemble it, the things to check for when you're done, how do you relubricate it, because I'm finding people are really loving videos versus written instructions, and I can understand why, because videos are a lot easier way for a lot of people to learn. And so we're thinking about in the very near future having something like that, because it has become such a problem, and the firing pin sales, or firing pin spring sales and firing pin changes, are here to stay.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things. It's to me, it's a maintenance item, and it's something that I clean my rifles all the time. I disassemble the bolt very often, just because I want to look in there and check and make sure everything's clean, and I relubricate, and every time I clean my rifle, I don't take out the firing pin, but I do. I don't disassemble it, but I do take it out of the bolt body. I have a brush with a patch that I send in there, clean everything out, blow it out with air, relubricate. I use that IOSO 3-in-1 or whatever they call it. IOSO cleaning oil.
Okay, I haven't tried that.
It cleans and lubricates, and like you said, it just leaves a very fine film behind. And I clean everything with that, and then I put it all back together, put grease on it, and goes back in the gun. But I do it every time. But yeah, I'm always in there. So, when at least once a year, I change out my spring, just because I'm afraid it's, well, it's like changing your oil too soon. The way I see it, it's like changing your oil too soon. It ain't gonna hurt nothing.
And I know you use silicon chrome springs from Wolf.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Which are very, a lot of the thing with this routine change got started with, there's so many firing pin springs out there that are made of music wire. And, or it used to be called spring wire, but it was also music wire for basically pianos and stuff, except it's bigger gauge than that. And that stuff relaxes fast. Man, sometimes you can have a bolt with one of them springs in and 1,000 rounds, that spring's dead.
Yeah.
And you can see it when you can take it out, because you lay it next to a new one and it's a lot shorter than the new one. Now, we're blessed with an actual spring gauge here, an industrial spring gauge, and I've got little fixtures made for it for Alpine bolt, Timberline bolt, BRM bolt, etc., the different bolt lengths, and I can drop a spring on there, and that takes it to the preloaded length inside the action when the action's cocked, and how many pounds of pressure does it have to get it to that point. So we can check springs, and we check springs when we receive them from our vendor, random check them to make sure that they meet spec, and they meet spec. They're doing a good job. So, and the Wolf springs that you're using are phenomenal springs. They are, because they're made of the same stuff that the dragster valve springs are and NASCAR spring material is made out of. They're made for multiple cycles. So, and whatever a guy feels comfortable with is what they got to feel comfortable with and do to keep their gun shooting, because it's a head game too, as we all know, Eric, is
Yeah.
the little maintenance things like that. If you don't take care of them, then you start, oh, I lost a shot. I wonder if it's because I didn't do this or didn't do that. And it's better to have done that than to have the doubt later.
Right.
So
The pretty much everything you just described, I guess, falls into, timing. Like, I know you discussed, someone could watch this and put it all together, but why don't you just take a minute to talk about bolt timing? Because that's a very big topic that a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah. Pet peeve of mine.
So a few topics that I want you to cover that, like that somebody wants to check their stuff. Let's talk about firing pin protrusion, firing pin fall, spring weights, and anything else that you think people need to know for sure, the basics.
Okay.
As to what, what's a good minimum to troubleshoot an action, so that if they're having issues, they can at least check those things and see if they could potentially have a problem.
Okay. Timing. Let's talk timing in a minute. Okay. Remington actions are roughly 33% cock on close. Okay. When I use the word cock on close, and I learned a lesson the hard way on one forum, I went, well, we're going to do some cock. Oh, geez, Jim, cock on close. That's terrible. That's, and I immediately recognized the guy was thinking of the old Mausers that you opened up and they didn't cock at all, and you fully cocked on close. And so I had to explain, well, I'm just trying to differentiate from what we developed years ago. A lot of us bench rest shooters, what we called neutral timing. We were very concerned with bag disturbance. And most of us were using Remington-derived actions or custom actions that derived off of the Remington Mauser concept. And almost everybody was set up with significant cock on close. Anywhere from 30 to 33%. So if you had 250 thousandths of firing pin fall, you had 1/3 of that. You were only opening 2/3 of that. And when you closed the bolt, you were cocking the other third. Well, with the little retainer notch on the back of the cam of most of the bolts, when you went to do that, you had this hitch that you had to go forward and down, and you'd be looking through your crosshairs and, oh crap, my gun moved. So many of us looked at, and some good friends started doing it for a famous bench rest shooter to make them neutral, but it reduced the firing pin fall to 190 thousandths because it didn't recut the cams and the bolts. All they did is shave off the cocking piece, and so that the thing just went down neutral. And believe it or not, we kind of got away with that with the 6 PPC, because with the 6 PPC, 95% or more of us were shooting Federal 205M primers. Had 16 to 18 pound springs, and we were shooting in the summertime. And we'd get away with it. We thought we were getting away with it, but vertical would creep in and some of the strange stuff would creep in. But so then, Bob and I were actually recutting Remington bolts and Hart bolts and Panda bolts to have a different cam in them, so that in the back of the bolt, I had a fixture on my manual mill that as the table traveled, I had my rotary. And then I had gears coming off the rotary with a chain that went down to the table drive on the other end. And I had figured out the gear ratio so that, okay, I moved this far, the rotary moved this far, and I could manually, without a CNC machine, recut the cams in those bolts so that if I had a 250 thousandths firing pin fall that I wanted, I could get a neutral timing on the action. Neutral timing means when you push the bolt forward and you start it down the closing cam. Now, my closing cams and my actions are 23-degree helix. So you come down that 23 degrees, and that's where the lugs start to engage the actual locking lug and pull. At that point is where you want the cocking piece to sit against the sear on the trigger and not move and not pull anymore. So that's a neutral timed action. You go forward, the bolt comes down a little to the end of the closing cams in the action. Then as you finish turning it the other 65 degrees basically, you turn it and that cocking piece does not move. And what that ends up with is a very smooth closing bolt. Boom.
Well, that's the thing about your BRM XDs. When we started using them on F class, we were used to actions that had cock on close.
Yep.
And all of a sudden this BRM XDs come out, and I mean you could close that bolt with your pinky.
Yeah.
It was just zero back disturbance.
Yep. But opening it was a different story.
Right.
Because by the time I'd got to the BRM XD, see, my original BRs, I designed around 215 to 220 thousandths firing pin fall. They were made for 6 PPCs with federal primers. Mm-hmm. We had a 16 to 18 pound spring, so I could neutral time them, have that firing pin fall, and I could shut that bolt and open that bolt with my fingertips. Boom. Dry fire, just bang, bang, bang. Well, then when I started making the BRMs and the BRM XDs, people are using bigger cartridges. They're using CCI primers. They're using Wolf primers. Then I got back into the whole, now I got to go back to the 250 thousandths firing pin fall, 24-pound minimum spring, to have enough energy to reliably set those primers off, 100-degree Texas day, and a minus 30 Saskatchewan day. So you had to have that full gambit of things. And in fact, in the hunting actions, like the timberlines, we've got some of the timberlines when guys are going to hunt that cold stuff that have 32-pound springs on them. And by God, you don't want them timed neutral.
Right.
Because they are a bear to open the full 250 thousandths with a 32-pound spring. But so that's, and so why I changed the Mountaineers for PRS and stuff, because the PRS guys were saying, and the hunting guys in my hunt private labels that make hunting actions are saying, man, Jim, these bolts are harder to open and blah, blah, blah. So I went to 30 to 35 thousandths cock on close, but I don't have that big retain. And some people gripe at me because I don't have that big retaining notch at the back of the bolt. I got just a baby one to make sure people don't accidentally, but you can still turn it by hand, where a Remington, you have to crank on. You can't get it to come up out of that detent and decock without a tool usually. Where I've got a baby one to keep it located. But so when you go in there and you've got that 30 thousandths cock on close, there's not much feel there. Yeah, it's not neutral, but it's kind of okay. A little resistance and down it goes. But it makes the bolt opening cycle so much easier. And I know Speedy likes the bench rest actions for him set up that way. He wants a little cock on close. He was never a fan of the neutral thing because of the lift. He wants minimum bag disturbance closing and opening, where with the heavier springs, we're trading off easy close, no disturbance, harder open disturbance. So it's kind of a trade. And depending on the primers you're using and stuff, then so we get into, and when people are having troubles, what I tell them, here are the key things to check. Firing pin protrusion should be 55 to 60, technically 52 to 65. Above 65 is too much because you're losing firing pin energy. When you have too much protrusion, because that firing pin is only going into the primer about 25 thousandths. A lot of people don't realize that. They think, well, my protrusion is the thing. And Bob Greenleaf at Savage, he and Mike Walker and Al Angerman ran a whole bunch of tests, published them in Precision Shooting Magazine with primer flame. They had a camera that detected flash, and they had little cartridge heads with a bolt set up and with primers in, and with different firing pin protrusions. They studied the characteristic of the flame. And they found that, Bob found with all of that work, 25 thousandths firing pin protrusion is all you need. But because of cold weather and dirt and grunge and variable conditions, most manufacturers settle on 52 plus, just to have a safety factor there. Which we follow, and ours are 55 to 65. Most of them end up around 59 to 60 is our target. But if you got 55 or 52, it's not cause for alarm. That's not causing you light strikes. That's not where the light strikes are coming from. If you've got less than 20 thousandths, then you've got something in your bolt. Or if you've got 30 thousandths or 35, there's something in your bolt, like one of them pieces of primer, or like your practice of brushing the bolt out is real good, because you never know what can get up in there that will stop the firing pin early in its fall. The second thing I tell them to check is, with my actions and bad actions, where my first actions, and for years, they aren't made that way now because they started becoming such a problem with the trigger hangers. I had bidirectional trigger hanger where there was a notch in both ends of it. You could put the trigger in it in either direction. I labeled the trigger hangers B-JWL or B-Bix or whatever. B meant, or not B, R meant rear.
Not right. It doesn't mean right.
Right. No. Yeah. And there was quite a good gunsmith, a friend of mine in North Carolina, that kept building these guns. The guys were calling me, and my primers won't go off. I need a stronger spring. Your bolts are no good. Blah, blah, blah. Hey, hang on. After I got the first one to send me his rifle, and I pulled the hanger out and said, wait a minute, trigger's in this frame backwards. Turned it around. Every time I pulled the trigger on CCI primers and cases put in his gun, I didn't fire any live rounds, but bang, every one of them went off. And so after that, I'd tell people, and sure enough, and I told the guns, and he said, oh my God, Jim, I thought that meant right. And then we ended up putting the engraving on the right side with the rear at the rear. So even if they thought it was right, it would end up right. And then we still had people miss putting them together, because some people were putting them together, not necessarily gunsmiths, but they're saying, oh, geez, Jim, I've got a super easy bolt close now. Man, this thing is, but I'm having trouble with my primer strikes. What'd you do? Did you do any? Well, you had it set up, it had a little more pressure on the bolt when it went down. You turned the trigger around in the frame, right? Well, yeah. Measure your firing pin fall for me. What's that? So I did a little YouTube video. It's rather crude, but it's on my YouTube list of how to measure firing pin fall. I didn't realize how a simple process like that, a lot of people know how to do, but there's many people that just didn't have a clue of how to measure firing pin fall. And
well, this is important, right? I mean, this is what I mean. This is like knowing how to check your oil in your car.
Correct.
It's or the 710 cap. If you turn oil upside down, it looks like 710. All right, we got a water bottle here. Just a real simple way, right? So this is your firing pin. Imagine this is in the center.
Yep.
And this is your cocking piece in the back.
Measure from the back tip of the there.
Well, so it's going to be protruding most likely. So you measure
Correct.
from there to the shroud, and
Correct.
let's just say that's 50 thousandths.
Correct.
Let's say this is 50 thousandths, and then you decock it.
Yep.
This is cocked. Then you decock it, and now it's going to be inside the hole. Then you measure again from the back of the shroud to the same back of the cocking piece.
Correct.
And let's say that's 200 thousandths. Then you add them together.
Correct.
That's your total firing pin fall.
And that's one of the most important things.
What do you want to have there? Between 230?
I want our old BR actions were 230, but the BRMs, BRMXDs, BRLs, the hunting actions, most of them we actually set up at 265.
So what's the least you want to have? If somebody's checking their stuff.
250. For reliable performance with all brands of primers in all temperatures, with in a BRM a minimum 24-pound spring. And that's what we found to be an optimal for tune is 24-pound. I know you and a lot of others are using the 28-pound, which works, and there's tunes for the 28-pound. And 28 pounds gives you a little more margin of error of extra there so that you're over, but you can go too far. If you put a 32 in, you're going to have firing pin bounce.
I've tried it. It's super hard to open that bolt.
Well, and you also get rebound, and you get puckered primers. People have shown me pictures of puckered primers. One, I've got the guy's action here now. No, they're puckered, and he says, "Geez, your firing pin spring's too light." And I says, "No, Larry, you've got too much firing pin spring. What are you using?" Blah blah. Oh.
Yeah.
Bad. You've actually, and what happened, why the pucker occurs is the firing pin is going forward, hitting the primer, setting it off, and then it's got so much energy that when it hits, it's like dropping something on the table. It bounces back. When it bounces back, that primer from the pressure inside the primer is following up in the firing pin hole. Then the firing pin comes back forward and bumps it and makes a little dish in the middle of it. So the puckered primer looks like it bled back into the firing pin hole, and then it's got a little dish with the firing pin tip. And it can cause, a similar effect can be caused from too weak a firing pin spring. But if the firing pin spring is too weak, the primer's not going to go off.
Yeah.
But if you've got fired primers that have the pucker, now there's a pucker that also comes from the hole being too big, which you've seen those, but I'm not talking about where the hole's too big.
Yeah, that's a typical Revit 700.
Yeah.
Old, people always thought I got too much pressure, and it's just simply the hole in the firing pin being too big. Yeah. And it just flows into there.
Yeah.
Okay, so to recap, firing pin protrusion, 55 to 65.
Yep. Yep.
Firing pin fall, about 250.
Correct.
Firing pin, the spring weight, 24 and up.
24 and up.
24 to 28.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Okay. Anything else?
I
think we covered
Drag.
Oh.
Drag. When you take your firing pin assembly system apart, I always recommend to people to make sure that things are the way they were manufactured. You take the cross pin out, you take the whole thing apart, actually put it back together with no spring, and put it in the bolt, and do I had a bolt laying here yesterday, but you do it upside down, and make sure that thing just goes clunk, clunk, clunk. If it doesn't go clunk, 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 start looking Do you have some galling inside the shroud or on the firing pin, or is something out of alignment? What's happened to cause that interference? Because no matter if you got a 28-pound spring or whatever, if you got drag somewhere, that's robbing you firing pin energy that you're trying to overcome with more spring pressure. So I recommend
more power, baby. More power.
More power. Hit it with a sledgehammer.
Exactly. Just need a bigger hammer, Jim. Come on. All right. Well, that's very important information. Bolt head sizes. What are the different ones for your PPCs, your 308, your Magnums, all that good stuff?
For 223, we use 378 bolt face size. Okay. For PPC and 308 with a Sacco style extractor, and in fact, the Borden Sacco style extractor, that the tip front end of it is shaped different than a standard Sacco, we use 0.480. Early in the game, when we had sliding plate extractors on our first actions, the bolt face for a PPC had to be 455 to hold the edge of the case so that sliding plate extractor caught the lip of the case and pulled it out. But with our Sacco style extractor, it puts hardly any pressure on the case. It will pull a PPC and a BR case reliably. Then the Magnum is...
So let's talk about that before we move on.
Sure.
Because that just means, I know we keep talking about the PPC, but now you have the 6 arc, which is pretty much a PPC.
Correct.
And you have the 6.5 Grendel, which
Correct.
means if you have a Borden action that is 308 bolt face, that has the Sacco extractor, you can chamber a barrel. You can turn that into a 6 arc or a 6.5 Grendel with no modifications. There's many actions that you can't do that on.
Correct.
Very important.
Very correct. Very correct.
So I just want to point that out because now we have the Grendels and the arcs.
Right.
And back in the day, you needed a special action or a special bolt head size.
Correct.
To run those cartridges.
Yep, I got frustrated with doing the different bolt sizes in about 2003 or 4, and that's when I converted to the Sacco. And the whole sliding plate extractor thing just drove me nuts. And people used to say, well, safety, Jim. Well, anytime you eliminate the 3 rings of steel that the repeater bolt nose has, and go to the coned bolt face, I have no problems with the Sacco style extractor at all in either design, but recognize that if you have a lodged bullet in a barrel and put a live round in behind it, the action's going to split. And it's designed to split with a coned bolt. It'll split and release the barrel. Bolt will stay put, and the action right around the tenon will split up through there and release the barrel and let the barrel downrange, because we're looking at 200,000 psi plus when you've got a loaded round behind a jammed bullet in a barrel. Now, if you have a repeater bolt nose on the bolt, even with my Sacco style extractors, I've had guys use... I had one gunsmith accidentally use 75 grains of reloader 15 instead of 75 grains of reloader 25 and a 7 Weatherby. Back calculated the pressures at 140-some thousand PSI based on action deformation. Did it deform the action? Yeah, it swelled the tenon. The bolt nose expanded and sealed in the counterbore of the barrel. The extractor, Sacco style extractor, contrary to common internet myth, never went anywhere. It stayed put. And that bolt nose still expanded like a Remington and sealed the back of that barrel. And yes, I could see where a little gas stream had come out by the extractor and cut the counterbore on the back of the barrel. But shooter didn't get hurt, no gas in the face, no catastrophic failure of the action. But anyhow, I was frustrated because I'd make actions for guys with a PPC bolt in them. Then the BR was making an advent, and it was, Jim, I need another bolt. And in those days, I wasn't set up to produce bolts as fast as I can produce bolts now, and it was a nightmare making those bolts. So I said, okay. So we experimented with some dummy pieces of aluminum and 4140 that was annealed, and just made dummy bolts with no thread, just shove in and out to extract cases. And we came up with where to set that socket extractor so it didn't put too much pressure against a 308 bolt head or case head when it grabbed it, and still pulled that 308 bolt head in the PPC. So all of our actions since, 2004 or so, they got 308 bolt faces are PPC compatible.
Okay.
Good thing. I'm glad you pointed that out.
And then you have the, from
Magnum.
there on, you move on to the Magnum, which is what?
.545.
And that does your WSMs.
Yep, that does the WSMs, the
Psalms.
300 rum, the 7 rim mag, all of the standard SAMI, Weatherby's, PRCs, the ones that are the 404 Jeffrey with rebated rim. Now, a 404 Jeffrey without a rebated rim takes a 560 bolt face.
And that would be what? Like your 338
the Dakota rounds. Remember the Dakota rounds that were made on the 404 Jeffrey brass?
What about the Lapua, the 338?
Oh, the 338 Lapua is 590.
Wow. Okay.
Yep. And then the Shytech is what? 5/8, 625, or is it 650?
Yeah, 625. 5/8 is 620.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, there you have it. That's your different bolt faces.
Yep.
Well, Jim, I have a lot more topics here, but we've been at it for almost 2 hours. Can you believe that?
All right. That's hard. That's going to be a long one. You're going to split this baby up. Huh?
Well, no, I think I'm going to just full send this one, and we're just going to have to do another one.
All right. Sure.
This is, you're just full of knowledge.
Oh, thanks.
I think we covered all the action stuff, unless you can think of something else. Oh, action materials.
Yes.
People ask often if one's better than the other. What are they made out of, and what's better?
We use 416, not 416R. We use barrel steel. We don't use barrel steel for action steel. We use 416, and we have it hardened to 39 to 41 Rockwell. Special heat treating process. Because you can heat treat 416 to 39 to 41 Rockwell with a bunch of different tempers. If that temper is above 675 degrees Fahrenheit, you get the same Rockwell reading, but you have no Sharpie strength, which is impact strength. And why is impact strength? Well, that's the corner of your threads, the corner of your raceways, the corner of your locking lug seats in the action. If you have no Sharpie strength with high impact loads, which, the cartridge going off against the bolt face and the lugs slapping all the time creates impact strength, you can end up with cracks. So it's a controlled heat treat for 416. Other steels that I have liked and used is 17.4 and 15.5. The thing I like about 416 hardened better than 17.4 and 15.5 hardened is 416 is more stable during cutting. I can put a port into one of the actions and not collapse the action. Whereas my experience with 17.4 and 15.5 both we had to carefully plan, control, and test all of our machining processes, like putting the tail on the action, where that, the tail comes down in the bolt notch. If we didn't do it in the right sequence, the tail would tip up and make it hard to get the bolt in. Mm-hmm. And we'd say, what the heck? Or you want to do it in the sequence so that tail slightly drifts down. Now that's doing them at 40 Rockwell. If you do 17.4 and 15.5 at 35-36 Rockwell, you don't get that same reaction. But I want my actions to be 40-ish to resist that gummy feeling that stainless has. Below 40. Below 40, when you get stainless below 40, you feel gummy. And it's got to be coated, and even coated like nitride, it still feels gummy because that nitride coating is tense thick. So the parent metal still comes into play when you're loading the bolt against the locking lugs. All three of the steels are good steels. The 17.4 and the 15.5, you can get a higher ultimate strength than you can with 416. But my attorney and I, in deep research, well, when you got 175,000 ultimate strength on something with cases being put in it that are rated at 65,000 psi, how far does the manufacturer go to protect against negligence of the user? And it's a conscious decision that you make, and he'd probably shoot me if he heard me talking about this, but it's one of those decisions you make. I'm already almost 3 times the working pressure of the case in the action. So why do I need a steel that's got 250,000 yield strength? Why overkill it? Why
you don't need a 3/4 ton pickup to go get groceries.
Yes.
Unless you live in Texas, obviously.
Unless you live in Texas.
We all use 3/4
or contrary to the people that I see around here pulling 19,000 pound fifth wheelers with their half-ton trucks. It's just the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. Okay. Now, they always ask about stainless versus, what's the other one?
Chromoly. Yeah. There's a belief that chromoly, because it's got a little different modulus of elasticity, it dampens a little more on vibration than stainless. My experience with all the chromolys, 43, 40, 41, 40, 41, 42, used them all. They deform. And everybody brags about machining full hard. Well, we're all machining full hard. I mean, I won't say we all are, but most of us custom action makers are machining our processes full hard so that we can get the truest actions possible. Chromoly crawls all over the place. You put the tail on, you put the ports in, you put the counter bore in the front of the action, and there's probably going to be some of my friends in the industry out there that tells me, well, Jim, you just don't know how to do this. Well, maybe I don't. I don't know. I think I'm a pretty sharp engineer and been machining for most of my life, so I think I can figure that stuff out. But my measuring of this stuff is chromoly actions are harder to make absolutely precise. Much harder than making at the same hardness. Now, if you use 32 Rockwell, basically barrel steel Rockwell chromoly, then there's less deformation than there is at 40. But once again, I like that 40 for the slickness.
Last question before we go. Thread fit. You talked about the tenon threads.
Yes.
I see so many gunsmiths on social media bragging about how snug they can get those threads. Is that good or bad?
Bad. And the reason it's bad is you load against the threads instead of the shoulder when you do that. I think we're the most perfect, and a little biased. And I put a little thing on on Facebook the other day of how we line the actions up using the true bore system to get our threads as concentric as we can to the board of the action. Even doing that, there's just a little bit of difference between those threads and the actual bore of the action. So if you do a tight crank-on fit and you go up against the shoulder, you'll get a light shoulder imprint. And you aren't using the shoulder as your load point. You're using your thread flanks as your loading point. And it can actually cost you accuracy. And it's one of the things that Adamovich and I played with truing the Remington 700s. Well, this fitted barrel to this snug crank-on, what we used to call crank-on fit. You know, you'd make passes and you'd try the action, you'd make passes. Instead of using the thread, we'd get it. So, oh, man. And then we'd blueprint it. And, oh, gee, it prints good, but it doesn't completely clean the print. Well, let's try it. So take it and shoot it, and shoot good or okay. Okay, let's put it back in the lathe, and let's chase those threads. Let's take them down so we got 3,000ths. We'll measure the pitch diameter, and this give it 3 or 4,000ths. And we made them to the point where they almost rattled. You know, you take hold of the barrel, and man, though, when that barrel went up against that action, crack. You know, it'd slam, and then you'd put it in the barrel vise and put the action wrench in and tighten it up. When you'd go to take it apart, it didn't want to come apart. And when it did come apart, it would make a cracking noise, a pop. Talk about shoot. Holy cow. It taught us, well, we don't want to be loose. That's because you can get some alignment issues, but you don't want to, like I published that our go is inch 025. And believe it or not, I have all these guys trying to fit it. Inch 025 is go. And I explained in that thread that I've shown a number of shops and shown them when they tell me that my action's wrong, that no, your thread form's wrong. But anyhow, wait a minute, guys, why are you fitting that inch? I'm telling you what the go is, but I don't mean to fit it at the go. I'd fit
That's
it
the
at
maximum.
That's the maximum. I'd fit it at, we fit ours at inch 022 to inch 023 pitch diameter to give 2 to 3 thousandths.
I do 23.
Yeah, just a little wiggle there. Just
Right.
a little wiggle. And
I
then
want to be
the
able
barrel.
I want to be able to screw the barrel easily.
Yes, no cranking. Yeah.
And you talked about that slam. I can ring the barrel. Just once it's there, kind of get it there. You can't pull it off by hand.
No, you got to put it in the barrel vise and put the action wrench in.
Take
right?
it off. But,
Yeah.
I do that, and then I just torque it to 75 pounds.
Yep. And 75 is plenty. It's no need. I've got guys doing 150 and
So what's your recommendation on that?
65 to 75.
Okay.
Which and it used to be my recommendation. I hate torque wrenches. As an engineer, I hate torque wrenches. Torque wrenches are one of the most imprecise tools that's out there, unless they're in the hands of people that understand what they're doing, that they've got a clean joint, clean threads that are lubricated the same way every time. So, and the bigger the thread, like a barrel thread, 75 foot-pounds plus or minus 1 or 2 is pretty reliable to reach. But scope block screws at 840 with fitted screws, the difference between an oily thread and one that's got lots of oil on it, 35 inch-pounds or 30 inch-pounds may not lock that baby up. You could have a loose rail, but anyhow, getting back, I used to tell people mine's the tippy toe torque. I used to hand thread it on until it clicked. And it's probably sacrilege for an engineer to be talking this way because of torque, but but I've had so many bad issues with torque wrenches so click it on. Then what I do is I put it in the barrel vise, put the action wrench in and back it up. Then I get up on my tippy toes and boom. And then when we go to pop them over, it comes out, Eric, about 65 to 75 foot-pounds of a guy my weight with the T-handle I was using. So I've told people, and now we torque them on, and we use a torque wrench, and we do 75 foot-pounds. So
that's different than spot torquing, right? Spot torquing. Are you familiar with spot torque?
No.
That's when you grab your T-handle and you tighten it until you see spots. That's too tight.
I've never heard of that one, but yeah,
that's too tight.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jim, this has been amazing. We're gonna have to have you back.
Thanks.
I got only halfway down the list of things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I think we covered the action side pretty well.
Okay.
Maintenance and all that. And if anybody has any more questions, they can simply put a comment on this video, and then, we'll revisit it next time.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Eric. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Jim, thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Okay. See you, Eric. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.